There is a place in America where distance is part of the punishment. To reach it, you drive for hours through empty desert highways. No cities, no crowds, no cameras. Cell service fades, radio signals crackle, and then, almost without warning, concrete rises from the dust. Razor wire cuts the horizon. Guard towers watch in silence. This is not just a prison. This is a system designed to disappear people. Inside these walls, control is measured in hours spent alone, in paperwork that decides where a man lives for years, and in policies few outside Nevada ever read. It's a place built to hold the people the state fears most, and to do it far from public view. Officials say it exists for safety. Records say it exists at a staggering cost. Court filings, investigative reports, and federal rulings describe a facility where isolation becomes routine, oversight arrives late, and consequences surface only when lives are already lost. A prison so remote that attention itself becomes a threat. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The most powerful prisons aren't the ones everyone talks about. They're the ones built to be quiet. Tonight, we're not telling rumors. We're not chasing shock. We're following the system, how it works, why it was built this way, and what happens when control becomes the mission instead of justice. This is the story of Ely State Prison. And once you understand how it operates, you'll never look at maximum security the same way again. Before we dive in, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe to HFD Achieve Crimes. Every bit of support helps us reveal the hidden truths behind the world's prisons and crime documentaries. Now let's go inside. Ely State Prison was not placed where it is by accident. Long before an inmate ever steps inside its gates, the prison's most powerful feature reveals itself through geography. Ely sits in eastern Nevada, surrounded by desert, mountains, and long stretches of empty highway. The nearest major cities, Las Vegas and Reno, are hours away. There are no suburbs nearby, no steady flow of visitors, no accidental witnesses. Reaching the prison requires deliberate effort, time, and resources, and that distance shapes everything that happens inside. In corrections planning, location is never neutral. Where a prison is built determines who can monitor it, who can work there, and how easily the outside world can look in. At Ely, isolation is not just a condition, it is an operating principle. For families, that distance becomes an invisible barrier. Visiting requires long drives, time off work, money for fuel and lodging, and navigation through remote terrain. For many, it becomes impossible. Over time, visits slow. Phone calls become the primary connection. Then even those fade. Isolation begins long before a cell door closes. For attorneys, the remoteness matters just as much. Legal visits take planning. Court deadlines stretch. Emergency motions move slower when the facility is hours from law offices and courthouses. Oversight doesn't disappear, but it becomes harder, costlier, and easier to delay. And for the media, Ely's location does what walls alone cannot. Journalists don't pass it by accident. There are no commuter helicopters overhead, no nearby press corps, no daily reminders that the prison exists. Coverage usually comes only after lawsuits, deaths, or federal intervention force attention back toward the desert. This physical distance creates a psychological one. Inside institutions like Ely, systems learn that scrutiny arrives late, that complaints take time to travel, that attention fades faster when the facility itself feels far away. Over years, that reality reshapes behavior, not through malice alone, but through normalization. When no one is watching closely, shortcuts become routine. Paper replaces people. Policies replace accountability. Staffing is also shaped by geography. Recruiting correctional officers to a remote desert town is difficult. Retention is harder. Turnover becomes common. Mandatory overtime fills gaps. New officers arrive quickly and learn fast, often inside one of the most intense prison environments in the country. Experience varies. Consistency suffers. This pressure doesn't excuse misconduct, but it explains how stress accumulates inside closed systems. Long shifts, limited backup, constant vigilance. In a place designed for maximum control, tension becomes part of the daily atmosphere. Even emergency response feels different in isolation. Medical specialists, outside hospitals, and mental health resources are not next door. Transport takes time. Decisions carry higher stakes. Delays compound. And then there's the symbolic message of remoteness. Placing a prison far from population centers sends a signal. This is where problems go to be managed quietly. Out of sight, out of mind. The public rarely sees what happens here unless something goes catastrophically wrong. Over time, that distance becomes self-reinforcing. Fewer visits lead to fewer questions. Fewer questions lead to fewer answers. Fewer answers allow systems to operate with minimal challenge. Ely is not unique in this design. Across the United States, many maximum security facilities are built in remote locations for similar reasons: security, cost, political convenience. But Ely represents the extreme end of that logic. A prison so far removed that attention itself becomes a disruption. And that is the foundation everything else rests on. Before we talk about control units, isolation, or lawsuits, it's important to understand this truth. Ely does not begin with bars or razor wire. It begins with distance. Because when a prison is built at the end of the road itself becomes part of the punishment and part of the system that allows everything else to happen. Ely State Prison did not emerge from a long-term plan to reform incarceration. It was born out of crisis. In the late 1980s, Nevada's prison system was under strain. Violence inside older facilities had escalated, and the state faced growing pressure to separate inmates considered the most dangerous or disruptive from the general population. Existing prisons were not designed for long-term high-risk confinement, and administrators warned that control was slipping. The solution was not rehabilitation or decentralization. It was containment. State records and legislative discussions from the period show a clear objective. Nevada needed a facility capable of exerting maximum control over a small but volatile population. The answer was a new prison built from the ground up to isolate risk, limit movement, and reduce contact, both between inmates and with the outside world. Ely's location was chosen to serve that goal. Far from Las Vegas, Reno, and the state's population centers, the prison would sit in a sparsely populated region where land was available, political resistance was low, and visibility was minimal. Remoteness was framed as security. Distance was framed as safety. From the beginning, Ely was designed differently from traditional prisons. Its architecture emphasized segregation units, controlled movement corridors, reinforced housing, and staffing patterns intended to manage extreme situations. This was not a facility meant for large-scale rehabilitation programs or gradual reintegration. It was designed to hold, contain, and stabilize. Officially, Ely was built to protect both staff and inmates by separating those deemed most dangerous. On paper, that logic was straightforward. Remove the highest-risk individuals from overcrowded prisons, place them in a controlled environment, and reduce violence elsewhere in the system. But design choices have consequences. By prioritizing isolation as a primary tool, Ely embedded a philosophy that control could replace interaction, and that separation could substitute for long-term solutions. The prison was not labeled a Supermax when it opened, but its structure reflected the same principles emerging nationwide at the time, especially during an era when tough-on-crime policies dominated public debate. Across the United States, the late 20th century saw a surge in maximum security construction. States invested in facilities built around segregation, long-term lockdown, and restricted movement. Ely was Nevada's entry into that model. Once operational, Ely quickly absorbed inmates classified as the system's highest risk, those with histories of violence, those linked to gangs, and those administrators believed could not be safely managed elsewhere. Over time, it also became the state's death row facility, further concentrating extreme custody levels in one place. What began as a solution to immediate control problems slowly became something more permanent. Instead of functioning as a temporary measure, Ely evolved into a long-term destination. Transfers out became rare. Classifications hardened. Isolation extended. Decisions made for short-term security began shaping decades-long confinement. Importantly, none of this required malicious intent. Systems drift when initial emergency measures become routine. Policies written to handle the worst cases start defining normal operations. And because Ely was far from public view, that drift attracted little attention. Legislators approved budgets. Administrators refined procedures. Courts deferred to security judgments. The prison did what it was built to do: hold people securely, quietly, and with minimal disruption to the rest of the system. But the very features that made Ely effective at control also made it resistant to change. Once a facility is built around segregation, reducing isolation becomes structurally difficult. Once a prison's identity is tied to maximum security, alternatives feel risky. By the time Ely's practices began attracting serious legal and public scrutiny years later, its core design was already locked in. Walls had been poured, policies normalized, culture established. Ely was not an accident. It was a deliberate response to fear, pressure, and political demand for control. And understanding that origin is critical, because the problems that later emerged did not appear out of nowhere. Ely State Prison is often described as a supermax, but that word is more complicated than it sounds. Supermax is not always a formal label. In many states, it is a function, not a name. It describes a level of control so restrictive that movement, contact, and choice are reduced to the bare minimum. Ely fits that definition not because of branding, but because of how it operates. At its core, a supermax-style prison is built around risk management, not rehabilitation. Inmates are classified not by what programs they might complete, but by how tightly they must be controlled. Every decision, housing, movement, recreation, medical access, is filtered through security. At Ely, this begins with classification. Inmates arrive from other Nevada facilities after being labeled high risk due to violence, alleged gang ties, escape concerns, or long disciplinary histories. Once classified into the highest custody levels, their daily lives change immediately. They are no longer managed as part of a population, but as individual security units. This is where Ely functions like a supermax. Housing is dominated by segregation-style units. Cells are designed to limit interaction. Movement happens on strict schedules. Contact with other inmates is minimal or non-existent. Even routine activities, showers, recreation, medical visits, are controlled, monitored, and often conducted under restraints. Importantly, this is not always framed as punishment. Much of Ely's restrictive housing is described administratively. Terms like administrative segregation, protective custody, or special management appear in policy documents. These labels suggest flexibility, review, and temporary placement. In practice, however, many inmates remain in these conditions for years. That's the defining feature of supermax confinement: duration. Short-term lockdown exists in most prisons. What separates supermax conditions is how long people remain there, and how unclear the path out can be. At Ely, classification reviews exist on paper, but outcomes often change little. Decisions are driven by perceived risk, not time served or behavioral improvement alone. This creates a system where temporary becomes indefinite. Another hallmark of supermax operations is environmental control. Cells are constructed to be durable, austere, and easy to monitor. Noise is limited. Property is restricted. Lighting is artificial and regulated. These features are meant to reduce chaos, but they also reduce stimulation. The goal is predictability. From an administrative perspective, this makes sense. Predictable environments are easier to manage. But predictability can also become stagnation. When days are identical and interaction is rare, time stops behaving normally. Weeks blur into months. Months into years. Ely also concentrates extreme custody types in one place. Nevada's death row is housed there, placing inmates already subject to long-term isolation inside a facility built around segregation. This compounds restriction and further reinforces Ely's supermax function. Critically, Ely does not operate this way in isolation from national trends. Across the United States, supermax-style prisons expanded during the late 20th century as states prioritized control over capacity. Ely followed that model closely, even if the terminology varied. The difference is that Ely became the endpoint. In many systems, supermax confinement is meant to be transitional. At Ely, transfers out are rare. Once placed at the highest custody levels, inmates often remain there unless courts intervene or classifications change significantly. This is why Ely's role matters. It is not just a maximum security prison. It is a containment facility, one designed to hold risk in place indefinitely, with minimal reliance on external oversight. Understanding that distinction is essential, because the controversies that followed, lawsuits, federal scrutiny, public concern, did not emerge simply because Ely was harsh. They emerged because Ely institutionalized a form of confinement where control itself became the mission. And once that happens, everything else, mental health, accountability, human cost, becomes secondary. Control does not announce itself with force. It begins quietly, with routine. Inside a high-security control unit, the day is not measured by hours or sunlight. It is measured by procedures, counts, door movements, meal deliveries, and paperwork that determines who moves and who stays still. Every action follows a schedule designed to reduce unpredictability. Cells in these units are built for durability and supervision. Concrete walls, fixed fixtures, limited personal property. The design minimizes damage and limits opportunities for confrontation, but it also minimizes stimulation. Sound travels differently. Light feels artificial. Time becomes abstract. Movement is rare and deliberate. When an inmate leaves the cell, it is usually alone, under escort, and for a specific purpose: medical, shower, recreation, or classification review. These movements are planned to avoid contact with others. The goal is not interaction. It is separation. Meals arrive through slots and steel doors. Conversations are brief and functional. Instructions replace dialogue. Even simple requests pass through layers of approval. Over time, this structure reshapes behavior on both sides of the door. For staff, control units prioritize predictability. Knowing where everyone is, minimizing variables, and preventing spontaneous interaction reduces immediate risk. In an environment housing individuals labeled high risk, this predictability is seen as safety. But predictability has a cost. When days look identical, stress accumulates silently. Inmates adapt by withdrawing, pacing, or fixating on small routines. Staff adapt by narrowing focus. Procedures first, discretion later. Empathy becomes harder to maintain when every interaction is filtered through security. Recreation, when permitted, is tightly constrained. Outdoor time may take place in small enclosures designed to prevent contact. Exercise becomes solitary. The purpose is not enrichment, but controlled release of energy. Showers follow similar rules. Escorts, timed access, limited privacy. Everything is regulated. Medical and mental health interactions often occur under the same constraints. Appointments may happen through doors or in controlled settings. Access depends on staffing, availability, and security clearance. Emergencies are handled quickly, but non-urgent care can move slowly in systems built around control. On paper, none of this is punishment. These units are described administratively, justified by risk assessments and institutional safety. Reviews exist. Reports are filed. Policies outline criteria. In practice, control units become environments where duration matters more than intention. Short-term restriction is common in prisons. Long-term confinement under these conditions changes people. Research cited in litigation and oversight reports has repeatedly warned that extended isolation affects cognition, emotional regulation, and perception of reality. The environment does not need to be violent to be damaging. It only needs to be unchanging. This is where control becomes something else. As months turn into years, the original reason for placement can fade, but the conditions remain. Classification reviews often rely on past behavior, perceived risk, or lack of available alternatives. Progress is difficult to demonstrate when opportunities to demonstrate it are limited. The system sustains itself. In facilities like Ely State Prison, control units are not an exception. They are a central feature. Their design shapes the institution's identity and daily rhythm. And once a prison organizes itself around this level of restriction, loosening it becomes difficult. Staffing models, architecture, and policy expectations all reinforce the same logic. Control first, everything else second. From the outside, these units are invisible. From the inside, they define existence. Understanding how control units operate is essential, because they are the setting where later controversies emerge. Mental health crises, use of force incidents, legal challenges, all of them unfold within this controlled, silent environment. Nothing here happens suddenly. It happens slowly, one identical day at a time. Solitary confinement is often described as a response to misconduct, a temporary measure, a cooling-off period, a last resort used only when nothing else works. But inside high-security prisons, that definition rarely holds. In reality, solitary confinement often functions as a system, not a sanction. In places built around extreme control, isolation becomes an administrative tool. It is used to manage uncertainty, reduce staffing strain, and contain perceived risk. Once that shift happens, solitary confinement stops being tied to specific actions and starts being tied to classifications, labels, and predictions about future behavior. This is the point where isolation loses its endpoint. Administrative segregation is typically justified as non-punitive. On paper, it exists to protect staff, other inmates, or even the individual being confined. Policies describe it as temporary and subject to review. Language like ongoing assessment and periodic evaluation suggests movement and flexibility. But systems do not operate on language alone. When inmates are placed in long-term segregation, the criteria for release often become unclear. Behavior inside isolation is tightly constrained, leaving few opportunities to demonstrate improvement. Minor infractions carry disproportionate weight. Silence is interpreted as compliance, but not necessarily as readiness for reintegration. Progress becomes difficult to measure, and uncertainty defaults to continued confinement. This is how temporary status becomes permanent. Over time, solitary confinement shifts from a response to behavior into a holding pattern. People are not necessarily there because of what they are doing, but because of what the system fears they might do. Risk replaces conduct. Prediction replaces evidence. Once isolation becomes routine, it also becomes easier to apply. Transfers into segregation happen faster than transfers out. Reviews become procedural rather than substantive. Decisions rely heavily on historical records rather than current conditions. The past becomes a barrier that the present cannot overcome. This structure creates a paradox. Inmates are told to demonstrate stability, but the environment prevents meaningful demonstration. They are told to follow rules, but rules alone do not guarantee release. They are told that confinement is temporary, but no timeline exists. The system sustains itself. Long-term isolation also simplifies management. Fewer interactions mean fewer variables. Reduced movement lowers immediate risk. From an operational standpoint, segregation is efficient. It contains problems rather than resolving them. But efficiency is not the same as effectiveness. Research cited in oversight reports and litigation has consistently shown that prolonged isolation carries psychological consequences, particularly when it extends for months or years. Anxiety, emotional flattening, disorientation, and difficulty with social interaction are not anomalies. They are predictable outcomes of environments designed to minimize stimulation and contact. These effects matter because they feed back into the system. Individuals affected by long-term isolation often struggle when given even limited freedom. Heightened stress responses, difficulty processing instructions, and increased reactivity can be interpreted as behavioral problems, reinforcing the perception of risk and justifying continued segregation. Isolation creates the conditions that justify itself. At Ely State Prison, this logic has shaped decades of operation. Segregation is not an exception layered onto the prison. It is embedded into how safety is defined and enforced. Once embedded, alternatives feel dangerous. Change feels uncertain. Administrative reviews continue. Policies are updated. Language evolves. But the core mechanism remains the same. When risk is unclear, isolation is the answer. This is why solitary confinement at this level cannot be understood as punishment alone. It is infrastructure. It is workflow. It is policy made physical. And when isolation becomes infrastructure, the question is no longer how long someone should be held alone. The question becomes whether the system knows how to function without it. Isolation does not affect everyone the same way, but over time, it affects almost everyone. In high-security environments built around long-term separation, mental health becomes inseparable from custody. The mind is not an accessory to confinement. It is one of its primary battlegrounds. And when isolation is prolonged, the psychological effects are not unexpected side effects. They are structural outcomes. Mental health professionals have long warned that extended isolation reduces sensory input, limits social feedback, and disrupts normal cognitive rhythms. Human beings regulate emotion, perception, and behavior through interaction. When that interaction is removed, the brain adapts in ways that are not always reversible. Inside restrictive housing, The environment is constant. Lighting rarely changes. Sounds are repetitive. Days follow identical patterns. Without variation, the brain struggles to orient itself in time. Attention narrows. Memory dulls. Emotional responses flatten or intensify unpredictably. For individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions, these effects are amplified. Prison systems across the United States hold a disproportionate number of people diagnosed with serious mental illness. Conditions such as major depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and trauma-related disorders are well documented in correctional populations. When individuals with these diagnoses are placed in long-term isolation, treatment becomes more complex and risk increases. Mental health care in restrictive housing operates under constraints. Access is limited by security protocols. Appointments may be brief. Interactions often occur through barriers. Medication management can continue, but therapy and observation are harder to deliver in environments designed to minimize contact. This creates a tension between treatment and control. On paper, mental health services exist. Evaluations are scheduled. Notes are written. Compliance is tracked. But effectiveness depends on context. When a patient's environment remains unchanged, isolated, static, restrictive, clinical improvement is difficult to sustain. Over time, symptoms that might be manageable in less restrictive settings can intensify. Emotional regulation weakens. Stress tolerance drops. Minor disruptions feel overwhelming. The system interprets these reactions as behavioral issues, further reinforcing confinement. It becomes a loop. Isolation worsens symptoms. Worsened symptoms justify continued isolation. Oversight bodies and courts reviewing conditions in facilities like Ely State Prison have repeatedly noted this tension. The concern is not simply that mental illness exists inside prison walls. It is that the structure of confinement can magnify harm faster than treatment can counter it. Another challenge is visibility. Mental distress does not always announce itself clearly. In environments where communication is limited and observation is brief, warning signs can be subtle. Requests for help may be delayed, misunderstood, or deprioritized amid security demands. What looks like withdrawal may be adaptation. What looks like compliance may be deterioration. Staff are not clinicians, yet they are often the first to observe changes. In high-stress environments, recognizing mental health decline requires time, training, and continuity, resources that are often strained in remote, high-security facilities. This is not about intent. It is about capacity. When a system is designed primarily for containment, mental health care becomes reactive rather than preventive. Intervention follows crisis instead of anticipating it. Reviews occur after deterioration rather than before it. Over years, this pattern leaves a record, not of isolated failures, but of predictable strain between human psychology and institutional design. Courts, investigators, and policymakers examining these records often reach the same conclusion. Isolation at this scale changes people in ways systems are not equipped to manage. And once those changes occur, reversing them becomes far more difficult than preventing them. Understanding the mental health impact of long-term isolation is critical because it explains why later chapters unfold the way they do. Emergencies, lawsuits, federal scrutiny. None of those appear in a vacuum. They emerge when human limits collide with systems built to test them. Serious incidents inside a prison do not begin with headlines. They begin with paperwork. When a medical emergency, suicide attempt, or unexplained death occurs, the first response is procedural. Counts are conducted. Staff are notified. Reports are written. Timelines are reconstructed through logs, checklists, and incident forms. Every action is documented, reviewed, and archived. This is how institutions account for crisis. At facilities operating under extreme control, those records become the primary window into what happened because there are few witnesses and limited external access. What the paper trail shows, and what it does not, matters enormously. In high-security environments, medical emergencies are shaped by structure. Inmates are confined behind locked doors. Observation is intermittent. Requests for care pass through layers of custody approval. When something goes wrong, response time is measured not just in minutes, but in movement clearances, staff availability, and security protocols. Emergency procedures exist for these moments. Staff are trained to respond. Medical teams are notified. Transport is arranged when necessary. But in remote facilities, response is inherently constrained. Outside hospitals are far away. Specialized care is not on site. Every delay carries weight. When deaths occur, internal investigations follow. Reports summarize conditions, note compliance with policy, and evaluate whether procedures were followed. These documents are intended to ensure accountability. They also frame how events are understood by courts, oversight bodies, and the public. Patterns matter more than individual cases. When courts and investigators review records from places like Ely State Prison, they do not focus on a single tragedy in isolation. They look for repetition, similar circumstances, similar timelines, similar conclusions. Over time, those similarities raise questions that individual reports cannot answer alone. One recurring issue in high-control settings is visibility. Inmates in restrictive housing spend most of their time alone. Staff checks occur on schedules. If distress escalates between observations, warning signs may be missed. By the time intervention happens, outcomes may already be irreversible. Another issue is interpretation. Behavior linked to mental health decline can be misread as noncompliance or manipulation. Requests for help may be documented as routine complaints. The line between clinical need and disciplinary concern becomes blurred in environments where security dominates. When families seek answers, they encounter the system through records, incident reports, medical notes, redacted documents, timelines that describe events clinically but omit lived experience. For families, these records often feel incomplete. For institutions, they are the official account. Legal challenges emerge when those accounts are questioned. Civil litigation related to deaths and medical emergencies relies heavily on documentation. Attorneys compare reports to policies, logs to surveillance, timelines to testimony. Gaps matter. Missing details matter. Inconsistencies matter. The absence of documentation can be as significant as what is written. This is where internal processes meet external scrutiny. Courts reviewing these cases do not require perfection. They assess reasonableness. But repeated emergencies tied to similar conditions, long-term isolation, limited observation, delayed response, draw attention to systemic risk rather than individual error. The paper trail becomes evidence not just of what happened, but of how the system functions under stress. These cases do not always result in public trials. Many are resolved quietly. Settlements occur without admissions of wrongdoing. Policies are revised. Training is updated. On paper, progress is made. But records remain. They accumulate over years, forming a narrative that no single report intended to tell. A narrative about how emergencies unfold in environments built for control and how human vulnerability interacts with institutional design. Understanding this paper trail is essential because it explains why later scrutiny intensified, why oversight expanded, why courts began asking harder questions. The story of what happens inside does not live only in cells and corridors. It lives in files. Force inside a prison is meant to be controlled, limited, and documented. It is not supposed to be routine. In maximum security environments, the use of force is governed by detailed policies. These rules exist to protect staff, inmates, and the institution itself. They define when force is permitted, how much can be used, and what must happen afterward. On paper, the process is clear. Force is a last resort, applied proportionally, and reviewed carefully. In practice, accountability depends on systems, not intentions. In high-control settings, interactions are already shaped by restriction. Inmates are confined. Movement is limited. Tension accumulates quietly. When conflict occurs, it often escalates quickly because there is little room to de-escalate through normal interaction. Orders replace dialogue. Compliance is expected immediately. When compliance does not come, force becomes the solution. Use of force incidents typically involve cell extractions, chemical agents, restraints, or physical control techniques. These events are designed to restore order rapidly. Once complete, reports are written. Supervisors review them. Medical checks are conducted. Video footage, when required, is logged. This is where accountability is supposed to begin. But in facilities built around long-term isolation, force can become normalized. The same units, the same staff, and the same procedures repeat day after day. Over time, extraordinary actions start to feel ordinary. Pepper spray becomes procedural. Restraints become standard. What was once a last resort becomes a routine tool. Normalization is subtle. It does not announce itself. Oversight depends heavily on documentation. Written reports describe why force was used, how it was applied, and whether policy was followed. These narratives shape every later review. Courts, investigators, and oversight bodies often rely on them as the official record of events. But documentation has limits. In some cases, reports conflict with other evidence. Timelines don't align. Descriptions vary between participants. When video exists, it can clarify events. When it does not, accountability becomes difficult. Decisions hinge on credibility rather than verification. This is why recording requirements matter. Policies often require use of force incidents to be captured on video to protect everyone involved. Cameras provide an objective record. They discourage misconduct and defend proper action. When footage is missing, incomplete, or unavailable, questions follow. Judges reviewing records from places like Ely State Prison have repeatedly noted that accountability weakens when evidence is limited. Not because wrongdoing is assumed, but because transparency is reduced. Without reliable documentation, oversight becomes reactive instead of preventative. Another factor is environment. In segregation units, force incidents occur out of public view. There are no other inmates present. Staff work in small teams. Supervision is limited by structure. This increases responsibility on reporting systems to function properly. When patterns emerge, repeated force in the same units, involving similar circumstances, oversight bodies begin to look beyond individual incidents. The question shifts from "was this justified?" to "why does this keep happening?" Training and staffing pressures play a role. High turnover, mandatory overtime, and stress increase the likelihood of escalation. Fatigue reduces judgment. Familiarity reduces caution. None of this excuses misconduct, but it explains why systems must be designed to counter human limits, not rely on perfect behavior. Use of force becomes most dangerous when it is invisible. When incidents are rare, they draw scrutiny. When they are frequent, they blend into routine. The system continues to function, but accountability erodes quietly. This erosion does not always produce immediate crisis. It produces records, complaints, legal filings, oversight concerns. Over time, those records accumulate into something larger than any single incident. They form a pattern. Understanding how force is used and how it is reviewed is essential to understanding why external scrutiny intensified. Because in environments defined by control, accountability is the only counterbalance. And when that balance weakens, consequences follow. Control inside a maximum security prison is not enforced by walls alone. It is enforced by labels. One of the most powerful labels an inmate can receive is suspected gang affiliation. In high-security systems, gang validation is presented as a necessary safety measure, an administrative process intended to prevent organized violence and protect lives. On paper, it is preventative, not punitive. In practice, it can become a trap with no clear exit. Gang validation typically relies on a combination of intelligence sources, tattoos, written materials, associations, confidential informants, and past behavior. Each factor on its own may be inconclusive. Together, they form a classification decision that reshapes an inmate's entire existence. Once validated, the consequences are immediate and severe. Housing changes. Movement restrictions increase. Access to programs disappears. Most critically, placement in long-term segregation becomes likely, and release from it becomes extraordinarily difficult. The logic is simple. Suspected gang members are considered ongoing risks. The solution is isolation. But unlike disciplinary sanctions, gang validation often has no fixed timeline. Reviews occur, but the criteria for removal are vague. Good behavior may not be enough. Time served does not automatically reduce suspicion. The label persists even when conduct changes. This is where the system tightens. In many correctional systems, the primary path out of validation is debriefing, providing information about gang activity. From an administrative perspective, this produces intelligence and disrupts networks. From an inmate's perspective, it carries serious danger. Debriefing can mark someone as an informant, placing them at risk of retaliation if returned to general population. For many, it is not a realistic option. Refusing to debrief, however, often means remaining in segregation indefinitely. Silence becomes confinement. Speech becomes exposure. This dilemma has drawn repeated scrutiny from courts and oversight bodies reviewing conditions at facilities like Ely State Prison. The concern is not whether gang violence exists, it does. The concern is whether a system that conditions release on cooperation creates coercion rather than safety. Validation decisions also rely heavily on confidential information. Inmates are often not allowed to see or challenge the evidence used against them. This limits meaningful review and reinforces the sense that outcomes are predetermined. Over time, the gang label becomes self-reinforcing. Segregation limits interaction, which limits opportunities to disprove affiliation. Lack of movement is interpreted as ongoing risk. The absence of change justifies continued confinement. The system sustains itself. From an institutional standpoint, this structure simplifies management. High-risk individuals are contained. Uncertainty is reduced. But simplification carries a cost. It shifts the focus from behavior to identity, from actions to assumptions. And once identity becomes the basis for confinement, time stops mattering. The psychological impact is significant. Inmates caught in this loop often describe a sense of permanent suspension, neither punished nor released, neither progressing nor resolving their status. Reviews occur, but outcomes rarely change. Hope becomes conditional and distant. Gang validation was designed as a security tool. In high-control environments, it becomes something else, a mechanism that locks people into long-term isolation based on prediction rather than proof. This chapter matters because it reveals how control expands quietly, not through force, but through classification, not through sentences, but through status. And once status replaces behavior as the measure of risk, the system no longer needs new reasons to keep someone locked away. Every prison has rules for complaints. What matters is what happens after they are filed. On paper, grievance systems exist to protect rights, identify problems, and correct mistakes. They are meant to provide inmates with a structured way to raise concerns without fear of punishment. Forms are submitted. Responses are required. Appeals are available. The process appears orderly. In high-control environments, however, the reality is more fragile. When daily life is governed by discretion, movement approvals, access to showers, recreation schedules, property limits, power operates in small decisions. A delay here, a denial there. Nothing dramatic, nothing overt, but enough to send a message. This is how retaliation is often alleged to occur. Unlike physical force, retaliation rarely leaves obvious marks. It appears administratively. An unexpected cell search, property damaged or confiscated, a disciplinary write-up for minor infractions, a classification review that changes nothing. Each action can be justified on its own. Together, they form a pattern. Proving retaliation is difficult by design. Institutions can point to policy. Staff can cite security concerns. Documentation exists to support nearly any decision. For inmates, the burden is heavy. Timelines must be precise. Records must align. Motive must be inferred, not stated. In restrictive housing, this imbalance is amplified. Inmates have limited access to legal resources. Communication is constrained. Evidence is controlled by the institution. Silence becomes safer than persistence. This is how grievance systems lose their power. When filing a complaint is perceived as risky, fewer complaints are filed. When fewer complaints appear, administrators conclude the system is functioning. The absence of grievances becomes proof of success rather than a warning sign. Oversight bodies reviewing conditions at facilities like Ely State Prison have repeatedly emphasized this dynamic. Retaliation does not require explicit threats. It only requires enough uncertainty to discourage participation. Staff are not immune to this pressure. Correctional officers working in high-stress environments depend on cohesion and trust. Reporting misconduct can carry professional consequences, social isolation, undesirable assignments, stalled advancement. Even when policies protect whistleblowers, culture determines whether those protections feel real. This creates a parallel silence. Misconduct that is not documented does not exist officially. Patterns that are not recorded cannot be addressed. Systems drift not because no one sees the problem, but because speaking carries cost. Retaliation claims also intersect with earlier chapters. Long-term isolation limits witnesses. Use of force incidents depend on reporting. Mental health concerns rely on recognition. When silence dominates, every safeguard weakens. Courts reviewing retaliation allegations often face the same dilemma: how to weigh competing narratives in environments with limited transparency. Some claims fail, others succeed. What matters is not the outcome of any single case, but the pattern that emerges when similar claims repeat over time. That repetition signals culture. A culture of silence does not require coordinated intent. It grows when systems reward compliance and discourage challenge. When stability is valued more than scrutiny. When raising concerns is seen as disruption rather than correction. In such environments, reform becomes reactive. Change occurs only after lawsuits, investigations, or external pressure force attention inward. Until then, the system appears calm. This chapter is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding how accountability erodes quietly. Not through chaos, but through routine. Not through violence, but through discouragement. Because when silence becomes the safest option, systems stop correcting themselves. When people talk about prison costs, they usually picture buildings, fences, and guard towers. Concrete, steel, razor wire. But in a maximum security environment, those visible elements are only the beginning. The true cost of control is hidden in daily operations, long-term commitments, and decisions that quietly compound year after year. High-control prisons are among the most expensive institutions a state can operate. They require more staff per inmate, tighter supervision, and constant readiness for emergencies. Every routine action costs more time, more labor, and more coordination. What might take one officer in a lower security facility can require multiple staff members in a high-control setting. At places like Ely State Prison, cost is built directly into the design. Restrictive housing units demand constant monitoring. Movement requires escorts. Even basic tasks, showers, recreation, medical appointments, become controlled operations that consume staff hours. When staffing levels fall short, overtime fills the gap. Overtime becomes standard, not exceptional. Fatigue follows. High turnover adds another layer of expense. Recruiting officers to work in remote, high-stress environments is difficult. Training new staff takes time and resources, and inexperienced personnel are more likely to rely strictly on procedure rather than judgment. That reliance reinforces rigidity, which in turn increases operational strain. Geography compounds the problem. Remote prisons face higher transportation costs for supplies, equipment, and specialized services. Medical care is particularly expensive. Serious conditions often require transport to outside facilities, coordination with external providers, and additional security measures during movement. Each trip carries logistical and financial weight. Death row magnifies these costs even further. Housing death-sentenced inmates requires heightened security, ongoing legal coordination, and long-term medical care. Appeals stretch across decades. As inmates age, healthcare costs rise. Regardless of whether executions occur, the infrastructure to support death row remains active and funded. Then there is litigation. Lawsuits are not visible in daily routines, but they shape budgets quietly and persistently. Legal defense costs accumulate. Settlements are paid without admissions of wrongdoing. Court-ordered monitoring adds administrative burden. Each case requires staff time, document production, and compliance efforts that pull resources away from daily operations. For taxpayers, these expenses rarely feel tangible. They appear as line items in budgets, spread across years and departments. The connection between control policies and financial impact is easy to overlook. But over time, the total cost becomes substantial. This financial structure creates inertia. Once a state invests heavily in a facility built around isolation, changing direction becomes difficult. Closing or redesigning such a prison means confronting sunk costs and political resistance. Reform requires new spending before old expenses disappear. Maintaining the status quo feels safer, even when it is inefficient. Control becomes not just a security strategy, but a financial commitment. That commitment influences policy choices. Alternatives to long-term isolation, expanded mental health care, step-down programs, increased staffing for supervised interaction require upfront investment. They challenge existing models. They introduce uncertainty. In comparison, Continuing current practices feels predictable. The system chooses what it already knows. This chapter matters because it reframes the debate. Ely is not only a question of safety or morality. It is a question of sustainability. The cost of extreme control is paid continuously, whether conditions improve or not. And once that cost becomes routine, it stops being questioned until the burden grows too heavy to ignore. For the small community surrounding Ely, the prison is not an abstract policy debate. It is an employer, a paycheck, a stabilizing force in an isolated economy. In rural regions, large state institutions carry weight far beyond their walls. They shape local identity, influence housing markets, and determine whether families stay or leave. When other industries decline or never arrive, a prison becomes one of the few reliable sources of long-term employment. This reality creates a complicated relationship. On one hand, the facility provides hundreds of jobs: correctional officers, medical staff, maintenance workers, administrative employees, and contractors. These positions offer steady income, benefits, and a sense of permanence in a place where economic opportunity is limited. For many families, the prison is the reason they can remain in the region at all. On the other hand, dependence comes with cost. When a town's economy relies heavily on a single institution, criticism of that institution can feel like a threat to survival. Allegations of misconduct, lawsuits, or calls for reform are often interpreted not as accountability, but as danger to jobs, funding, and community stability. This dynamic shapes public response. Local officials may defend the prison even while acknowledging problems. Residents may feel conflicted, concerned about conditions inside, yet fearful of what change might bring. Conversations about reform become emotionally charged because they are tied to livelihoods, not just policies. This tension does not mean communities support harm. It means they are navigating limited choices. High-security prisons are rarely placed in thriving urban centers. They are built where land is available, political resistance is low, and economic need is high. Over time, the institution becomes embedded in local life. Schools, businesses, and services adjust around it. Generations grow up seeing it as a permanent fixture. That permanence influences decision-making at the state level as well. Closing or significantly restructuring a prison like Ely State Prison would ripple outward. Jobs would be lost. Housing demand would drop. Local revenue would shrink. Even discussions of reform raise questions about economic replacement, questions that rarely have easy answers. As a result, change tends to be incremental. Policies are adjusted. Oversight increases. Language shifts. But the core institution remains because removing it would require a broader economic plan, not just a correctional one. That plan is often absent. This creates a moral paradox. A facility criticized for extreme isolation and human cost also sustains a rural economy. Accountability threatens stability. Stability delays accountability. Neither side feels fully justifiable, yet both are real. For staff, this tension is personal. Many officers live in the surrounding community. Their families attend local schools. Their neighbors work alongside them. Criticism of the prison can feel like criticism of the people who depend on it, even when the criticism targets policy rather than individuals. This further complicates transparency. Whistleblowing becomes harder when social ties are tight. Oversight feels external. Trust becomes fragile. Silence can feel safer than scrutiny, not because problems are invisible, but because consequences feel close. The town's dependence on the prison does not cause the conditions inside, but it helps explain why reform moves slowly. Institutions embedded in local economies resist rapid change because change threatens more than policy. It threatens identity. This chapter matters because it shows that Ely is not isolated only by geography. It is isolated by interdependence. The prison and the town sustain each other in ways that make separation difficult. And as long as that bond remains unaddressed, reform will always face limits, not just inside the walls, but far beyond them. After years of lawsuits, investigations, and public scrutiny, one question lingers over Ely. Did anything really change? On paper, the answer appears to be yes. Policies were revised. Oversight increased. Mental health evaluations were scheduled more frequently. Review processes for restrictive housing were clarified. Reporting requirements expanded. These changes were presented as evidence of progress, signs that the system had responded to criticism and adapted. And in some ways, it did. Certain practices were narrowed. Some inmates were moved out of the most extreme conditions. Language shifted from permanence to review. External monitors gained access. The prison was no longer operating in complete obscurity. But systems are not transformed by paperwork alone. What remained unchanged was the core structure. Ely continued to function as Nevada's endpoint facility for the highest-risk inmates. Long-term isolation, while adjusted, remained central. Segregation was still the default solution when uncertainty arose. The architecture, staffing model, and institutional logic stayed intact. This is the limit of reform inside systems built for control. When a prison is designed around restriction, reform tends to operate at the edges. Rules change. Forms change. Oversight increases. But the underlying philosophy, contain risk through isolation, remains dominant. Alternatives feel uncertain. Loosening control feels dangerous. Courts can mandate compliance. They cannot mandate transformation. As a result, Ely exists in a state of tension. It is more visible than before, yet still distant. More regulated, yet still restrictive. Improved in some respects, unchanged in others. Each incident now carries greater scrutiny, but the system continues to rely on the same tools. This is why Ely still matters. It is not an outlier. It is a case study. Across the United States, similar facilities operate under similar logic. Remote locations, high-control housing, long-term segregation, limited alternatives. Ely simply left a paper trail, court rulings, records, and public attention that forced its story into view. What Ely reveals is not just how prisons function, but how systems resist change. Fear of violence justifies isolation. Isolation produces harm. Harm generates lawsuits. Lawsuits prompt reform. Reform stops short of redesign. The cycle repeats. This raises a larger question, one that extends beyond Nevada. If extreme isolation creates predictable harm, and if systems know this, why does it persist? The answer lies in incentives. Control is measurable. Stability is rewarded. Alternatives require investment, patience, and political risk. Maintaining the status quo is easier than reimagining it. Ely also challenges a common assumption, that visibility alone solves problems. Attention matters, but it fades. Oversight helps, but it operates within limits. Without sustained pressure and structural change, systems adapt just enough to survive. That does not mean progress is meaningless. It means progress is fragile. For the people inside, time does not pause while systems debate. Days pass under the same lights. Reviews come and go. Change, when it arrives slowly. The impact of long-term isolation does not disappear when policies are revised. Ely still stands because the questions it raises remain unresolved. How much control is necessary? How much isolation is acceptable? And what does safety mean when the method causes lasting harm? These are not questions one prison can answer alone. They belong to the broader justice system, to lawmakers, courts, and the public that funds and authorizes confinement. Ely is not a monster. It is a mirror. It reflects what happens when fear shapes policy, when distance dulls oversight, and when control becomes easier than care. Its story endures not because it is unique, but because it is familiar. And as long as systems like Ely continue to operate, quietly and efficiently, the warning it represents remains relevant. When documentaries like this end, it's easy to move on. Close the tab. Scroll forward. File the story away as something dark, distant, and disconnected from everyday life. A prison in the desert. A system that feels abstract. Someone else's problem. That reaction is understandable. It's also exactly how places like this continue to exist. Facilities built around extreme control do not survive on secrecy alone. They survive on distance, fatigue, and the assumption that attention will eventually fade. Court cases settle. Headlines disappear. Budgets roll forward. And the machinery keeps running. What makes Ely State Prison different is not that it suddenly became humane or transparent. It's that its story exists. It's documented. It's cited in court rulings, investigative reporting, and reform debates across the country. It became a case study in what happens when isolation becomes policy and control becomes routine. And case studies don't disappear. They resurface when lawmakers debate solitary confinement. They resurface when judges weigh constitutional limits. They resurface when taxpayers ask why prisons cost so much and solve so little. Ely matters because it forces an uncomfortable question. What do we do with the people we fear the most? Punishment is part of justice, but punishment without limits becomes something else. When isolation lasts for years, when mental illness is managed with concrete and steel, and when silence replaces accountability, the line between safety and harm begins to blur. This story is not about excusing crime. It's about examining power. A justice system is not measured by how it treats the best among us. It's measured by how it treats the worst, especially when no one is watching. Rights do not disappear at the prison gate. Responsibility does not end with distance. Ely State Prison still stands tonight. Lights on, doors locked, time moving slowly for the people inside. Whether its future looks different depends on something simple and rare: sustained attention. Because systems like this don't change when they're attacked. They change when they're watched. And now you've seen it. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.